You won't believe what happened the moment I stepped into my new home. The HOA stormed in, angry, demanding, claiming my land, my lake, as if I didn't even own it. They laughed at me, thinking I had no power, no say. But what they didn't know was that I controlled the docks they used every day. Every single one. And the moment I revealed that secret, everything changed. You're about to see how a simple mistake from them turned into the ultimate revenge, and how I turned their rules against them. Stick around, because they never expected what came next. I had been dreaming about this house for years. Finally, after endless searching and negotiations, I had it. A small, peaceful home tucked away by a private lake. The kind of place where I could escape from the chaos of city life, sit by the water, and finally feel like I belonged somewhere. Everything was perfect, or so I thought. The day I moved in, I was still unloading boxes when I heard the first knock. Loud, authoritative, sharp. I opened the door, expecting a friendly neighbor or maybe a delivery, but instead, I was met with a group of people I had never seen before. They wore stiff uniforms, carried clipboards, and had a kind of hostility in their eyes that made my stomach knot. "Hello, you must be the new homeowner," the tallest one said, his voice cold. "I'm from the HOA, and we need to discuss your property immediately." Sure," I said cautiously, stepping aside. I didn't know what this was about. They pushed past me into the living room without waiting for permission. My heart started racing. They were demanding. Angry. They didn't smile. They didn't ask politely. They acted like this was their home, and I was trespassing. "You can't live here," one of them barked. "This land, this lake, you're on HOA property. You have no rights here." I froze. My mind raced. What? No rights? This is my property. I bought it legally. I have the deed. I have everything. One of them leaned in, smirking. "You don't understand the rules. The HOA controls the lake, the docks, everything in this community. You'll have to follow our rules, or we'll make your life very difficult." I felt my chest tighten. I had never experienced anything like this. The lake was right there, shimmering in the sunlight, so close I could feel its cool breeze even from inside. And they were telling me I didn't have a right to it? It felt like someone had just pulled the rug from under me. I tried to stay calm. "Look, I understand rules, I respect them. But this is my land. My home. My property. I haven't broken any laws." They laughed, a dry, sharp laugh. "You don't get it. Rules aren't just suggestions here. We enforce them. And trust me, we don't make exceptions." I wanted to argue more, to defend myself, but the way they were looking at me made me realize arguing might not help. They were used to people bending to their authority. They were confident, cold, and unapologetic. I felt small in that moment, like an intruder in what was supposed to be my sanctuary. After a long, tense conversation, they finally left, but not without slamming the door behind them. My heart was still racing. I stood there, staring at the space they had invaded, feeling a mixture of fear and anger. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought I was just another homeowner who would fold under their rules. But as I walked to the back of the house and looked out at the lake, I realized something. The docks, the ones they claimed as theirs, the ones they said I had no rights to, I controlled them. I had overlooked it at first because I was too focused on moving in. But in my research, I had discovered the HOA's mistake. Those docks weren't actually theirs. They were part of my property. And that meant everything could change. I sat by the water that evening, letting the golden light reflect off the surface, trying to calm myself. I replayed the events over and over in my head. How had they come in like that? How had they assumed authority over my home without proof? And most importantly, how would I respond? The anger I felt began to simmer into determination. I realized that if I approached this carefully, I could turn the tables. I didn't want to be confrontational, not yet. But I could plan. I could act. And when the right moment came, I could make them regret ever underestimating me. I also started documenting everything. Every interaction, every threat, every rule they claimed. I pulled up my property deed, photographs of the land, legal documents about the docks. I began to understand the power I actually had. Quiet, legal, undeniable power. They thought this lake was theirs, but in reality, it was mine. That night, I barely slept. My mind was racing with possibilities. I could call them out immediately, but I knew that would play into their hands. They would respond aggressively, create conflict, and I could end up looking like the aggressor. No, I needed a plan. Patience. Timing. Strategy. I had all the tools I needed. And deep down, I knew one thing. This wasn't just about the lake. It was about respect. About proving that I couldn't be intimidated. About showing that even the people who think they hold all the power could be outsmarted. Little did I know, the battle had only just begun. And the next few days would test every ounce of my patience, my courage, and my ability to think strategically. But one thing was certain, I was not going to let a few arrogant officials take away what was rightfully mine. Not without a fight. By the end of that first day, I had made a quiet vow to myself. They might have stormed in thinking they owned the place, but I would show them the reality. They didn't just underestimate me, they underestimated the very thing that gave me control. And when that moment came, it would be undeniable, unforgettable, and completely in my favor. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. My heart sank when I saw the caller ID, 3 numbers I didn't recognize, but somehow, I already knew. It was the HOA. I hesitated for a moment. My instinct was to ignore it, but I knew that could make them more aggressive. Finally, I answered. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This is the HOA," the man on the other end said sharply. "You've ignored our warnings. You are in violation of several community rules. Immediate action is required, or we will escalate this matter legally. And trust me, you don't want that." I could feel my jaw tighten. The tone of his voice was meant to intimidate, to make me feel small. But I refused to let it work. I took a deep breath. "Listen," I said slowly, "I've reviewed all the rules and regulations. I own this property. I have the deed. The docks, the lake, everything. This is mine. If you have a problem with that, we can discuss it, but I'm not going to be bullied over a misunderstanding of property lines." There was a pause on the other end. Then, a sigh, almost mocking. "You're going to regret this. You'll see soon enough." Click. The call ended. I stared at the phone for a moment, my mind racing. This wasn't just bureaucracy, they were actively trying to intimidate me. Their arrogance made them dangerous. But at the same time, I realized something important. Every threat they made gave me information. Their confidence, their need to assert control, it all worked in my favor. I decided to take action immediately. I started by mapping the property thoroughly. I walked every corner of my land, measured distances, checked legal boundaries, and took photographs. I needed proof, undeniable proof. Not just for myself, but for anyone who would try to challenge me. As I did this, I noticed something the HOA hadn't accounted for. The docks. The way they were positioned, the access points, they weren't just part of my property. They were the only route the HOA used to monitor the lake. They had no alternative access. That meant they were vulnerable. And for the first time since the confrontation, a thrill ran through me. I had leverage. Real leverage. Over the next few days, the HOA kept coming back. Each visit was worse than the last. One day, 3 of them showed up unannounced, carrying legal documents and cameras. They tried to assert authority, claiming they could find me, control my property use, even demand that I remove personal structures I had placed near the lake. But I stayed calm. I didn't argue, at least not loudly. Instead, I documented everything. I recorded conversations, took photographs of their interactions, and noted every threat. Every time they came, I learned more about their weaknesses. I noticed patterns, the way they relied on intimidation instead of legal proof, the way they assumed people wouldn't know their rights, the way they overstepped authority without consequence. One afternoon, I had a breakthrough. I discovered old property records buried in the county database. They showed clearly that the docks were part of my land. Not a dispute, not a gray area. Mine. And the lake, or at least the part they used to monitor, was also legally mine. I could enforce my rights, legally and publicly. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. But I didn't act immediately. Patience was key. The HOA thought they were in control, that I was weak. That was their mistake. I had to wait for the perfect moment. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had started noticing the tension. Some neighbors whispered, some gave sympathetic smiles when I passed. Others avoided me, wary of the HOA's wrath. I felt isolated at times, but I also felt more determined. I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was fighting for respect, for dignity, for proving that no one could bully me out of my own home. By the end of that week, the HOA escalated again. They sent formal letters, threatening fines, claiming violations of community harmony rules, which were so vague they could be interpreted in any way they wanted. They were trying to force me into submission without presenting actual legal evidence. I knew then it was time to act. But not recklessly. I couldn't just confront them directly and risk turning this into a legal battle I wasn't prepared for. I needed a plan that used their arrogance against them. I spent that night drafting letters, preparing photographic evidence, and reviewing every property law I could find. I wanted my actions to be undeniable. They couldn't claim ignorance. They couldn't claim I had no authority. And I wanted my response to be public, a lesson for anyone else who thought they could intimidate homeowners. The next morning, I started small. I sent an official notice to the HOA, pointing out the property boundaries, the dock ownership, and my rights as a landowner. I attached photographs, maps, and legal documents. I didn't threaten them. I didn't yell. I simply presented facts. Hours later, I got a response. But instead of backing down, they sent another intimidating letter. This time, it was stronger. Fines. Threats of legal action. A subtle warning about making life difficult for me in the neighborhood. I smiled. Not because I enjoyed their threats, but because I had already anticipated them. They thought they were playing chess. But I was already 3 moves ahead. And the real game hadn't started yet. I realized that the lake and the docks were my ultimate leverage. If I controlled access to them, I could control the HOA's ability to enforce their rules. That was the key. Everything else, fines, threats, intimidation, was secondary. For the first time, I felt the tide turning. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had the law, I had evidence, and I had patience. And most importantly, I had the element of surprise. They didn't know I knew the truth. They didn't know I had leverage they never saw coming. That night, I walked to the dock, letting the water ripple beneath my feet, thinking about the next step. The HOA believed they could scare me, push me around, make me comply. But the truth was, I had the upper hand. I just had to wait for the perfect moment to strike. And strike I would. Because when the moment came, it wouldn't just be about the docks. It would be about proving a point. About showing that power without knowledge is meaningless. About showing that those who think they control everything can be outsmarted by someone they underestimate. The morning everything changed didn't feel special at first. It started quietly. The lake was calm. The air was cool. Birds were picking at the grass near the shore. Nothing about that morning hinted that it would be the turning point. But it was. I woke up with a strange calm inside me. Not confidence exactly, but clarity. For days I had let the HOA push, threaten, intimidate, and assume they could control me. But now I had the facts. The deeds. The maps. The legal records. And more importantly, I had the patience to use them properly. I had decided that today was the day I made my first move. Before anything else, I walked down to the dock. The wooden boards creaked softly under my feet. The sunlight reflected off the lake like tiny sparks. From that spot, I could see everything: the path the HOA used, the lake section they monitored, even the route they took to get to their dock. Except it wasn't theirs. It was mine. For a moment, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The smell of the water, the gentle sounds, the stillness, it reminded me why I had chosen this place. I didn't buy this home to fight anyone. I came here for peace. But if I had to fight to protect that peace, I would. After a few minutes, I walked back to the house, organized my documents, and printed 3 copies of everything: maps, property lines, surveyor diagrams, historical ownership records, even the HOA's own public guidelines, which clearly contradicted their behavior. Then I wrote a letter. A calm, professional letter. No threats. No anger. Just facts. The kind of letter that hits harder precisely because it has no emotion in it. I attached the documents, placed them in a folder, and slid everything into a waterproof envelope. This wasn't the official confrontation yet. This was bait. Once everything was ready, I took one more look in the mirror before heading out. I wasn't shaking this time. My voice wasn't trembling. My hands were steady. I looked different, determined, ready. When I reached the HOA office, a small building near the community center, I walked straight in. The receptionist looked up, startled, probably expecting someone else. No one came in here unless they were paying a fine or complaining. "Hi," I said calmly. "I have something for the board. Can you make sure they receive it today?" She nodded slowly, hesitantly. Yes. I can put it with their documents." "Good," I replied. "It's important." I smiled politely, thanked her, and walked out. I didn't stay to argue. That wasn't the goal. The goal was to plant a seed. To make them curious. To make them think they still had power. The real move hadn't happened yet. It happened later that afternoon. Around 4 p.m., when the sun was starting to dip and cast long shadows across the neighborhood, I heard footsteps approaching my porch. Firm, deliberate footsteps. I stepped out and found the same 3 HOA officials from before, angry, red-faced, and holding the folder I had delivered. "We need to talk," the tall one said. His voice was already rising. "I assumed you would," I replied calmly. He shoved the papers toward me. "These mean nothing. Do you understand? Nothing. You're confusing yourself. The HOA oversees the lake. The community maintains the docks. You are subject to our rules." I nodded, not agreeing, just acknowledging the noise he was making. "Is that so?" I asked quietly. "Yes," he snapped. "And if you continue to challenge us, we'll escalate this to the county, to the courts, to wherever we have to. You're not in charge here. We are." I took a step back, just enough to make him pause. "I understand," I said. "And that's why I'd like all of you to walk with me for a moment. I want to show you something." They exchanged glances. Suspicious, irritated, but curious enough to follow. I led them through my backyard, down the grassy slope toward the water. The lake glowed gold under the late afternoon light. Birds flew low across the surface, skimming the ripples. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful for what was coming. When we reached the dock, I stopped and turned toward them. "This is what you've been threatening me over," I said quietly. "This dock. This lake. This access point." The tallest man scoffed. "Correct. And you are not authorized." Before he could finish, I held up my hand. "Let me show you something." I leaned down and pulled out a laminated document I had taped under the edge of the bench. I handed it to the nearest board member, a woman with sharp eyes and a cold expression. "Read it," I said. She scanned it, her face tightening. Then she froze. What is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly shaky. "It's the county survey," I replied. The official one. The one that shows this dock and the 10 feet around it are entirely on my land. Not HOA land. Not community property. Mine. The tall man grabbed the paper, eyes narrowing. He looked from the map, to the dock, to the tree line, to the markers I had placed earlier. That's impossible, he muttered. It isn't, I said softly. You never checked. You assumed. And because you assumed, you've been threatening me illegally for days. The woman opened her mouth to argue, but I continued before she could. And there's more. The lake section you claim to control? The access point you use for monitoring? The path the maintenance team takes every week? I pointed to the far end of the dock, where the walkway narrowed. All of that requires crossing my land. Every single part of it. And according to these records, I tapped the second laminated page. You have no easement. No right of way. No access permission. Nothing. Silence. For the first time since moving in, I saw fear in their eyes. Not anger. Not arrogance. Fear. The kind that comes when people realize they've crossed a line they can't defend. The tall man took a step toward me. Not aggressive this time, almost pleading. You're misinterpreting this. We have historical access. We've used this dock for years. This can't just be taken away. I tilted my head. Historical use isn't legal ownership, I said gently. You know that. And you also know that I could file a complaint today that would shut down your lake operations until this was resolved legally. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Imagine, I continued, my voice steady, a full investigation into HOA misuse of private land, unauthorized access, forced compliance, harassment, intimidation. Their faces went pale. And imagine, I added, what the neighborhood would think when they find out you threatened a homeowner for something that wasn't even yours. The woman clenched the laminated page so hard it bent. What do you want? She whispered. Ah, there it was. The shift. The moment they realized the power dynamic had flipped. I smiled softly. Not smug. Not triumphant. Just calm. Respect, I said. Nothing more. Nothing less. You will treat me like a homeowner. You will stop harassing me. You will revise your records and stop sending threats. And you will never step onto this dock again without my written permission. The tall man swallowed hard. His voice shook when he said, And if we don't? I gestured toward the lake, toward their precious monitoring spot. Then I shut everything down. Silence fell again. Heavy, thick, undeniable. They knew I could do it. They knew they had no legal ground left to stand on. They knew, without question, that the power had shifted. And I could see it clearly in their faces. For the first time, they were afraid of me. For a few days after the dock confrontation, there was a strange quiet. I wasn't sure if it was relief or just the calm before the storm. The HOA didn't come to the house. No calls, no letters. My neighbors even gave me cautious smiles, as if they were expecting something to explode at any moment. I thought I had them. I thought my first move had solidified my control. But I was learning quickly that people like that, people who crave authority and power, don't accept being outsmarted easily. They don't admit defeat quietly. On the third day, everything changed. I was in the kitchen, unpacking boxes from the last of the move-in, when I noticed a black SUV parked near the lake. Too large, too official looking to belong to a neighbor. I frowned and walked to the window. 3 men stepped out. Maintenance men, I assumed at first, but their uniforms looked unfamiliar. They weren't from the HOA. I knew every employee. Their movements were deliberate. They had tools, cameras, and clipboards. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and dialed the HOA's number immediately. No answer. Then their office number. Still nothing. Panic rose for a fraction of a second, but then I reminded myself, I had the upper hand. Evidence, deeds, the legal leverage. I wasn't defenseless. I stepped outside, keeping my distance, and called my lawyer. Yes, I said, trying to sound calm. There's a situation at my property. I believe these men are trespassing. They are claiming to be acting for the HOA, but I haven't authorized anyone to be here. The lawyer's voice was steady. Document everything. Photographs, video, anything. Do not confront them physically. I will file an injunction if necessary. They have no legal right to be there. I hung up, feeling a mix of fear and adrenaline. This was exactly the kind of escalation I had anticipated, but maybe not this soon. Still, I knew what had to be done. I pulled out my phone and started recording. From the safety of my porch, I captured everything. The men began measuring the dock, photographing the posts, and even stepping onto the lake with small boats. Every step they took was an overreach. Every movement was a violation. After a few minutes, I decided to step forward, not aggressively, but to assert my presence. "Excuse me," I called, keeping my voice calm but firm. "You are on private property. I have not authorized access. Leave immediately, or I will have to take legal action." The tallest man paused, looked at me, and smirked. "The HOA sent us. We're just doing our job." I shook my head. "Your job does not include trespassing. You are on my property. This dock, this lake, everything here is private and under my ownership. You are violating the law. Leave now." They exchanged glances. One muttered something under his breath. I could tell they hadn't expected resistance this quickly. And yet, there was still arrogance in their stance, that belief that authority alone would intimidate me. Minutes passed. They were testing me, waiting to see if I would flinch. But I didn't. Instead, I walked closer, keeping my recording device active, making it clear that everything was being documented. Finally, the man in charge stepped back. "Fine. We'll leave, for now. But this isn't over." I nodded. "It's over when the law says it's over. And for now, the law is on my side." They left. But the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it thickened. That afternoon, I received multiple calls from anonymous numbers, threatening me subtly, warnings about fines, legal battles, even veiled hints at community pressure. I ignored most of them. Each one only confirmed that I was getting under their skin. That night, I sat by the lake again, trying to calm my mind. The reflection of the moon on the water was beautiful, serene. And yet, it felt like the calm before another storm. I realized that the HOA wasn't just going to quietly comply. They were going to fight. Desperately. Recklessly. And I had to be ready for that. The next week was a test of endurance. Every day brought new letters, new threats, and even rumors spread among neighbors, trying to turn them against me. But I stayed calm, responded only when necessary, and documented everything. I refused to let emotion cloud my actions. Every time they struck, I had a counter ready. Every time they tried to intimidate, I had proof. Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the HOA board meeting. They had called an emergency session to discuss the ongoing issues with the new homeowner. I wasn't invited. I wasn't going to be. But I had a plan. I arrived early, parking across the street where I could observe. I watched the members arrive, smug, confident. They were sure they still controlled the narrative. They were wrong. I had already prepared a formal complaint, documenting every trespass, every threat, every violation of my property rights. I had copies for the county, for the local news, and for the HOA itself. I also had photographs, videos, and the county survey proving every point I had made. When I entered the room, there was an audible gasp. The board members froze. Their faces changed from smug confidence to shock. They hadn't expected me to appear, and certainly not with evidence in hand. "I've come to present the facts," I said calmly, placing my documents on the table. "You've threatened me, trespassed on my property, and acted outside your authority. Here is the evidence." I went through each piece systematically, calmly, without anger, without emotion, just facts. I pointed to the photographs, the survey documents, the legal citations. Each point landed like a hammer. By the time I finished, the room was silent. Not one of them spoke. Not because they agreed, but because they realized the tables had turned completely. One board member finally muttered, We didn't know." I cut him off gently. "You didn't check. You assumed. And that assumption cost you credibility and authority. The law doesn't care about assumptions. It cares about facts. And the facts are on my side." The meeting ended quickly after that. I left with my documents, my rights confirmed, and a quiet satisfaction that was deeper than any victory I had felt before. That night, as I stood on my dock, looking out over the lake, I felt the first real sense of peace since the HOA had stormed into my home. I knew this wasn't the final battle. There would still be challenges, still attempts at intimidation. But now, I had proven something important, not just to them but to myself. I could stand my ground. I could fight without anger, without rash moves, using intelligence, patience, and evidence. And most importantly, I could win. The lake was calm again. The moonlight shimmered across the water. And for the first time, I smiled, knowing that the HOA's arrogance had finally met reality. The days after the HOA board meeting were quiet. Almost unnaturally quiet. I knew it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they were recalculating, figuring out how to respond without looking foolish. And I had learned from the beginning that people like this, people who crave control, never retreat quietly. But I was ready. I had patience. I had evidence. And now, I had the confidence that nothing they threw at me could shake my position. One morning, a week after the confrontation at the board meeting, I received an envelope in the mail. Plain. Unmarked. I opened it carefully. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA, stating that due to disputes over property lines and community regulations, they were temporarily suspending all access to the docks and lake until a legal review could be completed. I paused. I had expected resistance, threats, and intimidation. But this? They were taking their own access away. For the first time, the arrogance that had always driven them was working against them. I smiled quietly to myself. The first move in the final victory was already in motion. I spent the next few days confirming everything. I contacted the county office, verified my rights, and ensured that all documentation was in order. Every letter, every photograph, every legal record, perfectly organized. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was controlling the situation. Then came the neighborhood. I began to hear whispers from neighbors, subtle acknowledgement of what had happened. Some admitted they had been intimidated by the HOA for years. Some quietly congratulated me. Even a few of the more vocal critics seemed to hesitate before approaching the HOA for advice. The real turning point came on a Thursday afternoon. I was standing on the dock, sunlight glinting off the water, when the HOA representatives arrived again. But this time, they were cautious. Their usual swagger was gone. I could see it in the way they moved, the way they looked around as if expecting a trap. I didn't move toward them. I stayed still, arms crossed, calm. "Hello," the tall man said cautiously. "We need to talk." "Yes," I replied. "We do." He glanced at the water, at the dock, at the path that led straight across my property. "We received your documentation. And the county records. And, well, it appears we were in error." I nodded. Not triumphantly, not smugly, just calmly. "It happens. But errors like these have consequences. You trespassed, threatened me, and acted outside your authority." The three of them exchanged glances. I could see the tension in their shoulders. They had underestimated me from day one. They hadn't anticipated a homeowner who knew her rights, who could think strategically, who could act calmly under pressure. One of them, the woman with the sharp eyes, finally spoke. We want to resolve this. privately, without further escalation. I studied them quietly. Their tone was almost pleading, almost human. For days, they had treated me like I was a problem to be crushed. And now, they were asking for respect. "Here's the deal," I said. "You stay off my property. You respect the docks. You follow the law. And in return, I will allow your limited access as outlined in the county records. No more threats. No more fines. No more harassment." They nodded quickly, relieved, eager to close the chapter. I could see they were calculating how to save face, how to present this as a compromise without admitting defeat. Let them. The outcome was what mattered. Once they left, I sat on the dock and let the sunlight wash over me. The lake rippled gently under a soft breeze. For the first time since moving in, I felt the real sense of peace I had hoped for. Not just because I had won, but because the victory had been complete. It was lawful, strategic, and undeniable. That evening, I walked the length of my property, inspecting the dock, the lake's edge, and the small paths that led to the water. Every corner of my land was mine to control. I realized that I had achieved more than just winning a battle. I had established boundaries, respect, and security for years to come. Over the next few weeks, the HOA attempted minor maneuvers, letters with vague claims, emails questioning my behavior, even one call from a board member attempting to guilt me, but every attempt failed. I had documented everything. I had evidence. And most importantly, I had patience. Then, word spread in the neighborhood. Slowly, quietly, people began to understand what had happened. The once powerful HOA, the group that had made everyone else fear them, had been outmaneuvered by a single homeowner. Whispers of admiration, of finally someone stood up to them, reached me from neighbors walking past, children playing, even during local errands. One afternoon, a neighbor approached me while I was tending the garden. "I heard what happened with the HOA, she said quietly, smiling. "You handled that so smartly. I wish I had your courage." I smiled back, humbly. It's not just courage. It's knowing your rights, and being patient enough to act at the right moment. It struck me then that the real victory wasn't just legal. It was about power, respect, and understanding. The HOA had tried to bully me because they assumed ignorance. Once that assumption was removed, their authority crumbled. And in a way, it was almost poetic. They had built their control on fear, and I had dismantled it with knowledge. The final confirmation came a month later. The HOA sent a formal letter to all homeowners, acknowledging misunderstandings regarding property lines and community regulations, and outlining a new protocol for dock access. The letter carefully avoided admitting fault but legally solidified my rights. My docks. My lake. My property. Fully recognized. I kept the letter. Not because I wanted to gloat, but as a reminder. Patience, planning, and knowing your worth can turn intimidation into respect. That evening, I stood on the dock again, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple. The water reflected the colors like liquid fire. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not anger, not revenge in the emotional sense, but quiet triumph. The HOA had tried to control me. They had tried to make me fear them. And yet, here I was, calm, unshaken, victorious. They had underestimated me. And that was their mistake. I looked out over the lake and allowed myself a small smile. The wind rippled through the trees. The water lapped gently against the dock. Everything was as it should be. For once, I felt completely, undeniably at peace in my own home. The battle was over. The docks were mine. The lake was mine. And my right to enjoy my property without fear or intimidation was finally secure. I knew one thing for certain. No one would ever question me again. Not the HOA. Not the neighbors. Not even myself. And that feeling of control, justice, and quiet satisfaction was sweeter than anything I had imagined when I first moved in.